We now return to Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute, the radio show discussing the honest truth about Illinois policy and politics. Here's AM 560's Dan Proft.
Dan Proft back with Pat Hughes, co-founder of the Illinois Opportunity Project, illinoisopportunity.org, on this edition of Illinois Rising and school funding, Pat. That was central to the discussion before the end of the recently concluded legislative session, and the talk is already now prospective. Talk about any kind of stopgap budget or larger budget deal. So much of it is focused on K through 12 education. There is no continuing appropriation at present, and so the threat, the specter of a lot of schools that are heavily reliant on state funding not opening in the fall, which is, just around the corner. As soon as school concludes, you already look into the next school year, of course, particularly from a fiscal perspective. This is a real thing, and so you have the Democrats suggesting that they have a solution to reform the school funding formula, to make it more equitable, and to fund schools at something approximating a level that gives districts the resources they need.
Yeah, the Democrats' proposal, Dan, this is like the old Don Clark Netsch strategy where, you take money from wealthier suburban districts and you redistribute it to other districts that need money. The problem is it's going to be a very tough sell in this economic environment. To me, these suburban districts where their property taxes are already high, their schools aren't performing as well as even they think they are. The idea that they're going to take some of their money and send it to the failing Chicago public schools when they know publicly, because of Karen Lewis and Forrest Claypool and Rahm Emanuel, that money's being wasted and just going to teacher salaries and pensions and nobody's getting educated, is going to be a tough sell for them. So it's a tough problem for the Democrats if they go that route.
Well, the Democrats in the Senate, being led by this flim-flam man out of Decatur named Andy Minar, who has proposed this quote-unquote school funding reform in several iterations over the last several legislative sessions. And it basically all comes back to the same thing. More money for Chicago, more money from suburban school districts to Chicago and to downstate school districts, and then all of the externalities associated with this Byzantine school funding formula, including poor suburban school districts, think Fort Heights, think Matson, still subsidizing Chicago. It's just a mess, and I think Minar and the Senate Democrats are trying to sell suburbanites and the rest of the state a bill of goods. But for more on this, we're pleased to be joined by State Senator Dan McConkey. He's a freshman Republican senator from Hawthorne Woods. Dan, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Glad to be on today.
So give us an analysis of Senate Bill 1, Andy Minar's education funding formula, quote-unquote, reform, which, from my look at it, was just the same old that's been in place and been proposed.
So in the past, what Senator Minar has promoted has been a form of redistribution. Well, in this last version, he actually has claimed to abandon that. And what he would do is he'd hold every school district, quote-unquote, harmless, right? So any money that you got from the state last year is the money that you're going to get this year. But this bill would actually then require that the state put in an additional $705 million into the system. And then it would be supposedly go out in a more equitable way to those districts that are the poorest, those kids whose districts are most underfunded. Except that they do this based on what they call evidence-based funding. And then what they did was they played with the evidence, right? They played with the levers that were inside of that formula in order to drive 70% of the new money. Now, we don't have $705 million to put into education, right? We're $6 billion overspending right now without a budget. This would take, though, that $494 million of that $705 million and send that directly into Chicago. 70% of the money, despite the fact that they only have 20% of the students statewide. So what does that mean? Well, they're saying no red lines. This means that, no kid would suffer, if you will. No kid would get less. But this requires that we be able to put $700 million more into the system. And then it inordinately weights all this money that would go into Chicago. So other, kids that are in very poor districts such as East St. Louis, Streeter, these type of areas, these kids would get pennies on the dollar compared to what Chicago would get. So, for example, I think East St. Louis would get maybe $200 per kid, while Chicago would get over $1,300 per kid, despite the fact that East St. Louis is much poorer than CPS.
Well, here's the thing. So it's a Chicago bailout, which is same old, number one. Number two, this hold harmless provision that they're hanging their hat on is a big scam because because yes, so we're going to hold you harmless for the money that you got last year, but you're talking about $700 million more in dollars that the state doesn't have to enhance funding for poor districts. Well, you would have to hold harmless in perpetuity forever and ever, because otherwise the definition of redistribution is some people are going to get less and some people are going to get more, from each according to their means to each according to their needs, I think Karl Marx once said. And so these suburban school districts, ultimately, if you can't finance that hold harmless in perpetuity, which you can't, they're going to be losers. And by the way, a lot of school superintendents totally get that. We did a story in one of my papers where we interviewed the superintendent of the Western Springs School District. He totally gets it. Where's the money going to go? Oh, next year. And then I'm just supposed to assume forever that you're going to hold me harmless. But I know if you can hold me harmless, then I'm going to lose 70% of my state aid. That's not a very good bet for me, betting on a politician's promise. And it's not a very good bet for any family in this state betting on politicians' promises in Springfield.
Well, and what we've seen in the past, so what's happened when we've been unable, under Democratic leadership, under Democratic governors in the past, to be able to fully fund education? Well, we did something called proration, in which we only gave 87 cents on the dollar to the various schools. And we still have that. We still have districts across the state, especially downstate, who are still being prorated of the total amount that they've been promised by the state. They only get maybe 80 cents on the dollar, in some cases even less. And so they have this outstanding balance that keeps growing of what the state owes them, while they're just trying to keep their head above water just to try to get basic education services to their kids.
Dan, what are the politics of this? So I just can't wrap my head around the idea that you are going to bleed out funds from competitive legislative districts in the next election, send them to the Chicago public schools to bail out Karen Lewis and all that rigmarole over there. What are your Senate colleagues thinking politically? Are they safe? Do they not care about protecting House seats? Take me through the politics.
Well, they are doing what Rahm Emanuel's bidding is. And Rahm has made it very clear. Look, if you look at the property tax rates that people in the suburban areas, even people downstate pay, it pales in comparison. It is significantly higher than what Chicago pays, right? And then in addition, Chicago games the system by taking more than half of their available land, their available equal assessed value. All those properties, like virtually everything in the loop, is not even taxed in a way that goes to schools. These are in what's called TIF districts, and this money just goes back to line the pockets of the developers who put up these buildings in the first place. And so they've taken virtually half of the city, set it off limits, so you can't even tax it for education. So they keep their rates artificially low. They take half the city off the books, so it can't be taxed for education. And then they go back to the state crying poor with their handout saying, we need more money for our kids.
Now,
which then what does that mean? That means that you and I end up paying for it through our income taxes, through our sales taxes. The other taxes we send to Springfield ends up going to subsidize the game and the developers that Rahm Emanuel's been playing in the city.
Yeah, paying ever-increasing costs for ever-declining product. I want to start, go back to the question that we started this discussion on. The idea of, as you mentioned, no budget. You actually, along with your colleague, State Senator Kyle McCarter, proposed a constitutionally balanced budget without raising taxes, but Democrats didn't want to hear about that. On a go-forward basis, everybody's now talking about appropriations for K through 12 education, so all the schools open on time in a couple of months. How do you think that plays itself out, particularly when the governor said he's not going to sign another stopgap?
Well, this is, I think, the biggest lever that lasts, that exists, because everybody wants schools to open on time, and there's probably a good, 40%, 50% of schools across the state that if there's not an appropriation for schools, if there's not money coming from the state, those schools just simply can't afford to open, or will only be able to afford to open for maybe 2 or 3 months. And so this is something I think that is going to be the biggest lever, biggest pressure point, biggest inflection point that we're going to see this summer when it comes to this debate. And, even in the last day, we've heard the governor say, you know what, I'm not going to sign a stopgap measure. I want a real budget. And Madigan's people have, essentially walked away from the table, saying they're unwilling to negotiate until the governor drops the other reforms that the state desperately needs. And the governor has said, we desperately need these things in order to keep businesses in our state. It's a giant game of chicken, and I don't know where we're going to end up. And I'm concerned that the Democrats are willing to simply just use our kids as fodder, if you will, in the battle this summer, and I don't know where they're going to end up at this point.
He is State Senator Dan McConkey, freshman Republican from Hawthorne Woods. Dan, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.